Okay, great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting us to have a conversation for the South Asian Lit Fest. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Jhalak Prize in conversation with Romesh about his wonderful book, Suncatcher, which was shortlisted and has had huge admiration from the judges who really enjoyed it. Romesh, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks very much. Delighted to be here in this weird sort of situation, but thanks for having me.
Pleasure. You'll have heard the judges talk so passionately about the book and what it meant for them to select it. And I have to say, I loved reading it. I found it really funny, actually, in places. Like I loved the wit of the book, and I thought it was so good at describing the ducking and diving that goes on in family life, and that moment in adolescence when the world opens up and you see that there could be more outside your home. Yeah. Actually, very literally, the light suddenly is outside your own home. I thought it was an incredible achievement. I wondered if you could tell us, how this story came to be and why you wrote it.
Well, it's been a very long journey in some ways. Because I don't know, I mean, with different writers, you have different ways of approaching books. This, if you like, the germ of the story, at its most fundamental level, which is, I guess, about the fragility of friendship, maybe, early friendship, a young boy's friendship, and how quickly things change, I suppose. That's, if you like, that's the sort of core of it, and the sense of loss that comes with the loss of a friendship for whatever reason. And that's been in the back of my mind since I was a kid, I guess. And I did have the loss of a very, very, my closest friend when I was very, very young. And so when I started writing, I suppose, I don't know now, it feels like, could it be 50 years? A long time ago. Even as a teenager, I started just scribbling down poems and fragments of things. This idea was there of how can I sort of grapple with this idea of loss? But I really didn't know how to do anything with it. And occasionally I'd write poems about it. And I think even one of my earliest poems that ever got published had to do with the loss of a friend, the death of a friend, in fact. But I really didn't know what could happen with it until maybe about 10 years ago. I thought I would like to put it into a story. And I have written short stories, not in the same location, not to do with the same sorts of kids, but the idea of this sort of loss. But it was only after I finished my last book, which was a book called Noontide Tour, which was set in sort of, at the time, contemporary Sri Lanka, right after the end of the war, and looking at life at the end of the war. When I'd done that, I thought I was ready to, in a sense, see where this story that has been around with me for decades, really, where it would go. I started writing it, and that would have been in about 2014, 13. And then slowly it took this shape of the story of these two boys and this particular kind of loss, if you like. And also the political backdrop, I think that grew over it as well. And in a sense, it's a story about a boy discovering friendship, but also discovering a little bit about how the world might be working.
Yeah.
And particularly the politics behind it. And I suppose it's the way, as you were saying, ducking and diving, not only within families, but as we know, within societies, in our politics today, wherever we happen to be living.
And I think another thing that it's interesting, you've always had the story in your head, but actually one of the things that the judges picked up on, and is evident when you read it, is it has a very timely sense in terms of the climate and the earth we live in, and the way we treat that surrounding as well. And that felt really poignant, actually, to be reading it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, all of us who write books, I think, have this sense that when you eventually get something sort of working, that you're working with, if it's going to go anywhere in terms of getting written, then it has to be the sort of right time. It has, almost the climate has to be right. And in this, I mean, what you're talking mainly about, I suppose, is Jay, the older boy, who is in his time, I guess, what we would think of in terms of as environmentalist, whatever, when someone really interested in the natural world. And he, this boy really is. But this is at a time when, of course, we didn't think of the world in those terms. So the first books about it were coming out, about environmental damage were coming out, but there were books that were, in a sense, though they were popular. Rachel Carson's book, I think, was out in the 60s. It didn't kind of feed into the popular imagination worldwide in the way we now are aware of things. And so as I was writing this book, it suddenly sort of I began to see how that early period, how Jay could, in a sense, be someone ahead of his time.
Mm. Yeah, and he comes across almost as quirky in his time for his interest in those things, and yet now we see how
yes, he's quirky, and he also embodies, I think of as not so much the dilemmas but the tensions between, and this is particularly true of earlier generations of people who were interested in the natural world. They were interested and were keen to, in a sense, nurture it, but there were also people who liked to control it. So the people who knew most about how that natural world worked were also the people who quite often would be hunters or shooters or, that sort of thing. And that relationship, I think, I find really, really interesting. I do remember it from my own boyhood. Adults who I met, who I knew those days, the people who knew about how things worked out in the wilderness were also people who interfered with it.
Yeah, very much.
And you have it all over. I mean, in this country, I suppose, Ted Hughes is quite an interesting example of a man who, again, was deeply, deeply involved with the natural world and had a huge love for it, but was also somebody, who liked to be in control of that natural world.
Yeah.
So those dilemmas.
I think, and that's part of the push-pull of that dynamic of friendship, isn't it? Is recognizing what they bring, and what they bring is a danger of a different perspective, and that's what's so tantalizing. And it's how you can learn from that. And one of the lines I loved was, he said, "Could we be inseparable if our fathers lived in two separate worlds?" And I thought that was a brilliant line. Has so much to think about there. And that nature, the politics, the families, it's all there.
And I suppose it is like, what are these bonds that suddenly happen between people? And this is friendship, it can be love, it can be whatever it is that suddenly brings two people who unexpectedly together. And I suppose in this book, in a sense, all the bonds are pretty unexpected. Cairo's parents are in some ways very mismatched, but maybe they are perfectly matched. Jay's parents are mismatched and certainly aren't perfectly matched. But I mean, there's always this case, something that it's not quite opposites attract, but it's kind of this very strange, it's like these magnets sort of get into each other's force fields and then they're kind of stuck there.
Yeah.
And I think with that sort of early friendship, I think a lot of people perhaps recognize that sense of suddenly you have a friendship which is in some ways unequal, but you don't quite know where the inequality is. And sometimes it can flip.
Yeah, no, I think I found that that took me to that moment that I remember very strongly, that sense of the power dynamic changing in your world, and you suddenly understanding that there's a different way of viewing the world out there. And I think that was something that the judges also liked, was that this book took them into a friendship, into a place that they might never have imagined, and that felt something very strong for them. And I think I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were in terms of books and reading in these times of isolation and fear, and they however many struggles there are about how we get them and what stories we read, they are the potential for connection and hope and unity is there. And I think we felt that very strongly with all the long-listed and shortlisted books. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think it's the old saying, the E.M. Forster's saying, there's only connect, and in a sense, what fiction can do is connect people. And, in a sense, books, particularly, I feel this with fiction, I think it's very important for a novel to be read, to actually have, it's not a one-way thing. It's not just writing it. Writing it has its own satisfactions. But I think it doesn't become complete until it does connect with someone else. And to me, it's, and it's particularly true in these times when you are kind of closed in on yourself. You feel that, we have this strange sensation now of being separate and very individual, but at the same time, we are hugely globally connected in a way that we probably almost have never been, because of what's going on. So that balance between being totally alone and at the same time totally connected is interesting. And I think it has pluses and minuses in terms of reading, actually. I know for some people it's quite difficult to get into a book now, because you kind of want to know what's going on, sort of thing. It's quite difficult. And I do quite a lot of mentoring and teaching, and I know a lot of my students, for example, are finding it difficult to read or to write because they're in the state of limbo. But if you can get into a book, actually, you can get into that experience of intimacy, which you really can't get any other way. And actually, never mind COVID, if you were not in lockdown, I've always felt and I've always said that, in a way, the relationship you build up with the characters in a book that you read, the relationship that you have with characters in fiction are probably the most intimate relationships you ever have, because you are completely at one with these characters in a way that you can't with other people, as it were. You always see facets of other people, but this is all there is, and it's you and your imagination. So I think that again does nurture us, I think, in times like this.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's so precious about that process. And actually, in this time, I found myself reading more deeply, reading things that I have struggled to get into before. And I think I've been really happy to stick my head in the sand of a book and, shut out the world.
Also, there is fewer opportunities for distraction, isn't it?
Yes, that's true.
So you can, and you can get into the books, and it's a good time to.
And what would you've mentioned a couple of writers, a poet and Forster, and who are the writers, or what sort of thing do you seek out then for, as we've talked about, solace or joy or hope? Are there things you...
Well, for me, I think reading is always about kind of discovery. So it's always a balance between, reading things in which you can, I know, we always like to read things about ourselves to some extent, but I actually quite like to read things that seem to be about things that are very different from my experience, and then discover that it actually is the same.
Yeah.
And so, you know, whether it's writers who are setting their stories in, you know, in very, very different places, but it's the writing that brings me in, and then I discover the characters are the people that I kind of know. So that's what I suppose that's what I'm drawn to quite often. And of course, at the moment, you know, I suppose I'm reading the, you know, some of the students I've had have produced some amazingly good books. One was actually on your long list, I think. Claire Adams' Golden Child. I think was late.
Yeah, which is
Elaine Chu is
lovely.
another student who's got some short stories. So I'm looking at that. I'm actually, oddly enough, for probably the first time in all the books I've been writing with this one, Suncatcher, I've actually been rereading it because I'm going to be doing an audiobook of it, so I have to read it out loud.
Okay.
So that's a bit of a weird thing to be doing, because usually with a book, after you've written it, you get to know about 3 pages quite well because you do a lot of reading things, but you never actually go back to the whole thing. So that's quite strange.
Well, that's a very nice treat to have to look forward to. I think that that would be great, actually, to know that you're doing the audiobook. Well, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to the Jhalak Prize. I hope it really goes well. So thanks very much.
We're enjoying celebrating all the books, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.